and welcome to People and Their Poems podcast, a podcast about the poems that matter. I'm here today with Amy Dorio, a writer and teacher of poetry from Woodbury, who is going to talk to us today about the poems that matter to her and how they've affected her writing and her teaching career. Welcome, Amy.
Hello. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time. Would you describe for our listeners the kind of writer you are?
Sure. Some people talk about writing as a child. I did the typical try to make a book, but it was the only subject I wasn't really pathetic at. But I really didn't begin, and I wrote poetry in high school, like everyone wrote poetry in high school, but I didn't start thinking of myself as a writer until my father suggested I didn't have a job, and he said, go be a reporter at the Wilton Bulletin. There was an ad, and I was taught to write by my local town editor. And I really loved it. And that's when I really identified as a writer.
I can relate to that. I remember being taught to write by my editor at the New Milford Times years and years ago.
It's a tough way to learn. I wanted to actually share this and give a shout out to Mr. Bartlett, who taught me, because and I hang this in my classroom because he wasn't thrilled about being a teacher to me. And he once gave me this note, and I remember he used the word cumbersome and about my writing. And it was like the first time that somebody really criticized me. It hurt, but I didn't give up. And then like a few months later, he left a note that just talked about how much better I got. And he used the word concise. So I have it pinned up always in my room saying, that, we can all get better at writing. And I don't know where he is or what he's doing, but I'm so thankful for him.
Would you be willing to read all or part of that to our listeners today so they get a sense of his voice?
Oh, sure. You want me? It's short. He says, the 2 Board of Ed stories you did this week were particularly well done. They were concise, fact-filled, and had good and useful quotes. These are examples of good reporting and show you have improved your skills. The stories also flowed, and that's in quotes, easily for the reader, an example of good writing. Work more on the mechanics and you'll go far.
That sounds like the universal writing rubric right there. If you have those things, you're on the road. That's terrific. That's terrific. So you were writing about the school board back in your early days as a writer, but when you choose your subject, what subjects interest you most?
As far as poetry goes, I think I'm always drawn toward nature, and then how we relate to it. So I love that whole idea of the haiku, right? And you're supposed to spot something in nature and then make a parallel, right, with your own, human world. And, but I love nonfiction writing. I've enjoyed writing memoirs because I do it with my kids every year. So I love doing it. And I love all forms of journalism. I love writing about people who do interesting things. I think we all like the people feature. But I also like just writing a really good short news story too. I like it all. So what I don't excel at is fiction too much. I read and love fiction. I can't do it. So
they are really distinct genres, I think, and I can relate to that. I have a friend, my former copy editor, who has said to me more than once she believes there's a novel in me, and I'm not so sure. I think I think actually the nonfiction of journalism aligned with the observation, the keen observation that's required to do that effectively really speaks well to the needs of poetry and to bring that together.
I recently took a class studying Gwendolyn Brooks, and she really, toward the later half of her life, really tried to find like new forms of poetry, particularly for the Black voice. But one thing she did was to try to combine poetry and journalism. And she published a piece, I believe it was in the 60s, about going back down to, I don't think it was Birmingham, it was one of the towns famous for civil rights action. And she wrote about what she saw, but she did it in verse. So it was, I think that's very cool. And so that's just like you're saying, that there's something connective about the two.
Yeah, I think the immediacy, and and it also speaks to the relevance of poetry in our world now. That the combination of thought and feeling come together, and it's not the subjectivity or the fancifulness of fiction. It is the intensity of lived experience that we're getting at, and how better to do that than through the poetic form, which demands so much of our linguistic skills. It's a discipline in itself. So I'm going to have to look up the Gwendolyn Brooks piece that you were talking
I said
about.
it's not anthologized at all. So, we got this weird like JPEG thing out of the class, so I'll send it to you. It's beautifully done. And I thought, why has no one done this since? It seems to me like a great idea.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like a great way to mix genres for students too.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. All right. Sounds like a plan. All right. With that in mind, what poem or song brought you to poetry, do you think?
So I had to think about that, and you're gonna sigh. Everyone who watches this is gonna be like, oh. But it is Mending Wall by Robert Frost. My father could like recite 3 poems. Ode to a Mouse by Robert Burns, Mending Wall by Robert Frost, and Annabel Lee by Poe. And inevitably, and this is during the true supper hour of the 70s, right? We had supper time. And he would put his feet up on the table and he would either open this book up and read a poem, or he would recite one of those. And he just loved Mending Wall. And so I think his reciting poetry is what made it a part of my life. And that poem later on, he read it at my wedding and applied the thoughts of Frost to marriage. And it's funny because I'm so happy to have snatched, my father's no longer with me. And, I was able, no one else in the family wanted the book of poetry. And I was like, well, that's Dad's book of poetry. So, I have, and I just opened it up to prepare for you. And I have my wedding picture next to Mending Wall. So, and I don't want to be too verbose here, but because he did that, I did that with my children. And I did that with their friends who came over. And a young boy, my son's best friend, wrote me a letter recently. And he literally said, poetry from atop the table and your father's point on the wall. So I must have conveyed a Mending Wall to them. And I think I used to make them stand on the table when they read, probably like a Dead Poets Society like thing, but it's stuck in his memory. And I really, I think I just have to credit my dad.
That's amazing. So that takes it across the generations as well, the significance of family, but also of that particular poem.
Yeah. And when I do my poetry unit on the slide, and I always have to kind of tuck it in somewhere. Um, I start with telling them to go home and ask your parents, like, what's their favorite poems, or does grandma have a favorite poem? Why? I make them fill out this whole little sheet, and we share. And not everybody has great responses, but a lot of kids find out a lot of things about their family by doing that.
Is there any particular moment that you can think of that speaks to the power of that lesson?
As far as like students,
Yeah.
um, only that they see it's not some lofty thing, that's that they come in and they hear. I mean, we get a lot of Dr. Seuss response. I mean, we're really not getting in like Kerouac. you know, but I do think it makes them understand that poetry is a part of everyday existence. So um, I think in the last year, Amanda Gorman did that for them too. When they saw her speak, they were like, oh, she's a kid, and a poet. And so I love when it becomes like accessible to them.
Yeah, that was amazing. And she is a prolific poet. I think she's got what, 5 books out now,
I
you
know.
know?
I know she's, and the way she speaks, she said she had a speech impediment, and whatever. But she was just so beautiful, and what she wrote was beautifully done. Another teacher and I she did The Miracle of Morning. I think it's a earlier poem, and we had used that in our lessons toward the end of the year during the pandemic, and we just asked kids to watch it and mention something about it. This is when, right, you wouldn't give them much to do. You were just hoping for 10 minutes of work, and right.
Right. Yeah. Those days well. Yeah.
Yeah, fill out the Google form. And whatever. But I just thought, what a wonderful way to make poetry accessible to them. And I can't think of anything specific for you.
But I hear you though, and I remember hearing her deliver that speech at the inauguration, and the wordplay as well, the spoken word aspect of that poem, which was the sound of the words and the homonyms and those kinds of things, and the homophones. I'm sorry. That it was just delightful to hear her play with language, which takes us back to Dr. Seuss and Shel Silverstein, and also those
Sure.
more complex, adult, deeper poems for sure. But she played with language to get us thinking about who we are as Americans,
Yeah.
and to play on that idea of hope, which is delightful. And there you go. There's the power of the poet on the public stage.
Yeah, we do a thing where it's, I just do like come up with as many questions as you can about poetry. And, there's so many, like, what is it really? And why do we need it? And, and so by the end, they're really able to answer a lot of those big questions. So I love doing it. I can't believe it gets rejected by curriculum administrators, but I see it as being really fundamental to writers.
It is. It is central. I mean, our first full story was a poem. It was Gilgamesh, right? And
Yeah.
if that's about the complex human struggles, I think everything else is a variation on that. So you've talked about your students and what you have going on in the classroom. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your own writing? What is your focus when you create poetry, and who's your audience? How do they feel about it?
I think I started coming back to it during the pandemic, and some people made bread. I decided I was going to learn to use Twitter and to begin writing poems again. And so I picked something small like haiku to just get me going. And And so, I would inevitably write them kind of as I was walking the dog and then post them later in the day. And there's instant gratification when you get the little like, if I got the like. Um, and so it got me back going again. Um, I've written longer pieces, not good for Twitter. Um, but my guess my frustrations have been that there's no one to share them with. My husband's like, I don't get poetry. So, like I'll read him something. He's like, I don't get it. I feel um, but I do want to try to write some free verse, a bit like Kwame Alexander. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah,
So like
yeah.
whole books and free verse. I've been writing a few that I think might be really nice for fourth graders, fifth graders about young people. And um, I'm, I don't want to psych myself out. I'm just trying to have fun writing. Um, and, like I conceived of the project and I can already feel like I'm psyching myself out, by having a project. Maybe I shouldn't, but I want to try to write some narrative free verse um, about kind of like that pre-adolescent um, stage of childhood.
I could imagine that would be very helpful to many of us out there, including people in the high school level. What's going on with those kids that are just coming out of that phase? But you mentioned Kwame Alexander. He is a poet in residence at NPR. Have you seen some of his crowdsourced poems that he has created based on reader input?
I heard he's doing it. I've read some of his books, of course. And there's just no one more fun. Oh my God. He's just the most infectious human being ever. He's just like catnip. Um, but no, I saw that he was doing it and I haven't looked to see, but what a fun idea to do in the classroom, right? To try to put a group poem together. I should look at that.
It is, and just Google up NPR Morning Edition Kwame Alexander. And what is so interesting about what he comes up with is they seem to have a single voice.
Interesting.
And the last one had he said he had 600 poems to look at. So there's a form on the website. You put your information in, you put your poem in, and then he had to go through 600 poems to put this together. But they're disparate voices, different ages, different concerns, and it was an epistolary poem. So people wrote poems to somebody,
Okay.
and he pulled from that to create another poem with a single voice. And I thought the same thing when I read it. I'm doing this in my classroom. I mean, what a way to build community and a sense of belonging, but to find those lines. And I thought, wow, to take the source material and have different groups put the poem together and see what they pull out as being significant, and see
Yeah.
you get as many different products as you had groups, you know?
Yes. And total engagement.
Yeah, which is what poetry does, curriculum editors out there, it is, and it does it like I've seen nothing else do it, it's powerful stuff.
It is. I agree with, I don't, they're like, it's not, there's not too many common core standards. And I'm like, it teaches the kids how to read closely because they're learning figurative language because they have to write figurative language. And it's just, and you learn so much about your students. It opens them up. It's just does so many things, particularly toward craft and writing, I think. Um, but anyway.
Well, I agree. And I believe the subjective aspect of that asks them to think critically about that thing about which they're subjective. So you have a strong opinion, you're emotional about this, but now you've got to get objective with it because you're applying all those other skills. And
Yeah.
you have an audience. Other people are going to read this. And now you're engaging in public discourse through art. Those are the speaking and listening standards, the language standards. It's all there. It's all there. So we will subversively teach poetry as we go.
Yeah.
You know.
As any, well said, as any English teacher, I'm sure there's all of us out there doing the exact same thing.
That's right. That's right. And on that subject, would you read one of your students' poems, maybe, if you would, to just kind of help us get our heads around what the effect of poetry is on sixth graders?
I would love to. And I chose her poem. I knew from day one she was a writer. But she is just one of those kids that was very reserved. I never felt like I particularly had any great impact, except that, she was in a writing class. Have you heard of the Connecticut Writing Project?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, she submitted, almost didn't, and then was chosen to be published and asked to read her poem. And I think it's a poem that is surprising because it speaks to the interior life of a sixth grader. And it's a little surprising, that interior life is, well, you'll see. I'm wondering if I have it up. I'm going to try to switch screens. Can you still see me?
We can see you, sure thing.
Okay. So I'm gonna read her poem called A Beloved Affliction. Your obsessions, the burning sting it delivers, this satisfying control, an offering glow, the euphoric intensity, a cherished indulgence, a transcending glare, a shining glimpse of praise. The desolate feeling as it escapes you, a dreadful surrender, the sorrowful memories, they conquer you, the shaky feeling, agony with such fulfillment. An apathetic illness, a faded sanity, it has paralyzed you. Your discontented thoughts scatter throughout you, your secret passions, your shameful intentions for a moment of elation. And that's right, a 12-year-old girl or 11-year-old girl, which, I've wondered, what is the affliction, which she never states. And it's, I think it's a little shocking that there's this very serious interior life going on in a sixth grader.
And the range of vocabulary and the word choices, each word is a metaphor in itself, and to take that journey with her through whatever that affliction is, just leaves you in the end with that moment of awesome silence. But I'm just trying to imagine a sixth grader pulling that language together.
But they can, and they
Yeah.
and they do. I'm not saying every child has that vocabulary, but I think often we view childhood as, like they're very simple, and they're just not, they never are. And then some of these, particularly girls, can be very sophisticated in their language use. I've had boys too, but, it always seems to predominantly, a lot of girls seem to have that language development ahead of the boys. And anyway, so I was very proud of her. She did not read because she had too much anxiety about it. Like I said, she's a very quiet girl. But
That is amazing. And it makes me think, okay, as a new school year approaches, as a teacher, there will be rooms full of new people with rich interior lives, stories, hopes, and aspirations. And none of that will be simple. And none of it's, you know, show up for your X number of minutes of this subject and then get to the next place before the bell rings, you know, this obstacle course of thought that they have to go through. But think about the people you meet on the street every day. They're accumulating more experience all the time.
Yep.
And to be able to articulate it like that, I think we all have the potential. But the creativity and that muscle needs to be exercised, and the power of language in a way that makes us responsible citizens who can engage in discourse. What better platform than poetry? Look what that child did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Anyway, I find that the kids, you know, especially after, I mean, there's definitely some letters to counselors after some of it. But, you know, you're happy for finding that out, you know, and that child has an outlet, a place to go talk to. But, you know, if it weren't for I always start the year with, because that's the only time I'm given free rein. I start the year with poetry, and it's super helpful for getting to know children. And there's just, because poetry doesn't have really any rules, I can bend it toward any child. You know, if they're a sports person, you can show them Kwame's, you know, and they can just write a page full of onomatopoeias if they want to, you know. You know, but it's really lovely for getting to know them.
Do you find that your poetry work at the beginning of the year establishes the positive climate for the rest of the school year?
It's yes. And we just have, you know, fun. We start with poetry and then we move to graphic novels. So the beginning of the year is really fun. And then we go into essays, which is like, you know, because they've never really done like introductions and stuff like that. So they're actually learning to paragraph. We go 8 rounds over hitting the tab button, and, you know, I fall to the ground, you know, whatever. So it's, yeah, right. You know, you're like, oh my God, like, you know, like just, and sometimes they you know, so anyway, so it's our fun time. And we, you know, last year we made up words, we did portmanteaus, you know, so they're the only people in that school who know that word. But, you know, we had fun like creating words, and then they did it for the rest of the year. We would try to involve a creative element into all the sorts of different arguments and essays we were doing, you know, and just even our titles, something to make it creative and fun.
Well, that's cool. And I think Lewis Carroll would be very pleased with the portmanteau words in their essays.
Yeah, you know, they love that stuff, right? You're like, make up a word. Okay. You know, sure thing, Mrs. Dorio. So
That's fun. All right. Well, Amy, thank you so much for taking your time to join us for People and Their Poems podcast this afternoon. I think your insights are helpful for teachers and non-teachers alike, as well as for all of us about the value of poetry in everyday life. And for the benefit of our audience, we'll put some notes in the podcast about the Connecticut Writers Project. So if people want to explore what that's all about, they have that resource as well.